Floor for questions. Please place your questions in the question and answer section, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. This program is being translated in Rohingya and Burmese. Our thanks go to our two translators who have quite a task to complete. If you want to hear the translation, you can switch to the Rohingya or Burmese channels at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, Chairman Nurul Islam, the floor is yours.
Rohingya ဘာသာစကားကိုနားထောင်ခြင်း Rohingya တို့ယူပေးနိုင်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာယခုအစီအစဉ်စတင်ပါပြီအန်ကယ် Nurul Islam ကိုဖိတ်ခေါ်ပါရစေရှင်ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်
Thank you very much Regina Thank you everyone
ကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ် Regina ရေအခုလိုပြောပြတာ
And first of all I as the chairman of the Arakan Rohingya National Organization
ကျွန်တော်ဦးအနေနဲ့မိတ်ဆက်ကမယ်ဆိုရင်တော့ကျွန်တော်က ARNO ရဲ့ဥက္ကဋ္ဌတူဖြစ်ပါတယ်
I thank every participants and the panelists
ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့ကတော့တက်ရောက်လာသူတွေနဲ့ဆွေးနွေးပေးသူအားလုံးကိုကျေးဇူးတင်တယ်လို့ပြောပါရစေ
for your time
ဘာသာပြန်တွေကိုလည်းကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်မိမိတို့ရဲ့အချိန်တွေကိုထည့်ပြီးတော့ယခုလိုလာပြီးတော့ပြည်တဲ့အတွက်ကျေးဇူးများကြီးတင်ပါတယ်
Professor and Dr. Habib Siddiqui
Dr. Habib Siddiqui နဲ့ Professor Michael Chani တို့ကအားဖြည့်ကူညီပေးမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
I am just
ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့ကတော့
a brief overview of the Rohingya history
Rohingya လူမျိုးတွေရဲ့သမိုင်းကြောင်းကိုအနှစ်ချုပ်ပြီးပြောသွားမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
To begin with, history is the matter of life and measure of its performance. It reflects human life in all passing phases.
ကျွန်တော်အနေနဲ့အဓိကကြတော့ပြောချင်တာကတော့
And evaluates its works through ages.
အခုလိုမျိုးကျွန်တော်တို့အနေနဲ့က
Every country or every people has history.
နိုင်ငံတိုင်းမှာဌာနေတိုင်းသားတွေဆိုတာရှိပါတယ်
People past history determining the pace of present progress and the shape of history.
မိမိတို့အနေနဲ့ကဒီဌာနေတိုင်းသားတွေကကမ္ဘာပေါ်မှာတူညီသောသမိုင်းကြောင်းအစဉ်အလာတွေလည်းရှိပါတယ်
Rohingya are a predominantly a Muslim community.
Rohingya တွေကကြတော့အစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာကိုအဓိက
glorious past.
ပဲကြသူတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Unfortunately their history has remained totally
ကျွန်
neglected.
တော်တို့တွေကသမိုင်းကြောင်းအစဉ်အလာအရကြီးသူတွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်သို့တော်ညာလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့တွေရဲ့သမိုင်းကြောင်းတွေကဖုံးကွယ်ထားခြင်းခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်စိတ်မကောင်းစရာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Like many indigenous ethnic peoples living on
ကမ္ဘာပေါ်မှာ
Burma,
ရှိတဲ့ပြီးတော့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံအပါအဝင်ကမ္ဘာပေါ်မှာရှိတဲ့
their culture distinct
ဌာ
from
နေ
the
တိုင်းရင်းသားတွေအတိုင်းကျွန်တော်တို့ကလည်းဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားမျိုးနွယ်စုတစ်ခုဖြစ်ပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့မှာကိုယ်ပိုင်
connection to
ကိုယ်
the
ပိုင်ဘာ
high
သာစကား
cultures
ရှိ
of
ပါတယ်
the world.
ကျွန်တော်တို့က
and bravery.
ရခိုင်ဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေနဲ့လည်းအတူတူကျွန်တော်တို့ရှေးကလေးအတူတူကနေခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
Their sublime civilization was a gift to the whole people of the kingdom of Arakan.
မှာအာရကန်ဆိုတဲ့ဘရင်နိုင်ငံတော်ရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
And prospered in international trade.
ဒီအာရကန်ဆိုတဲ့ဘရင်နိုင်ငံတော်ကဆိုရင်တစ်ချိန်တစ်ခါ
Through ideas and learning, a flourishing civilization
နိုင်ငံတကာပင်လယ်ရေကြောင်းတွေမှာအင်မတန်မှကိုအောင်မြင်ခဲ့တဲ့
in
သူတွေ
modern
ဖြစ်ပါတယ်ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်မိမိတို့က
for centuries Arakan
မြန်မာ
had
ခေတ်
the
ကာလမှာလည်း
rights and
သင်ရှားစွာရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
civilizations, Hindu, Buddhist, and Islamic.
ပြီးတော့ဒီဒေသကဆိုရင်အာရကန်ဒေသကဆိုရင်ဟိန္ဒူတွေရောဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်တွေရောမွတ်စလင်တွေရောပြုံးပြီးတော့နေထိုင်အစေအရှင်စကရေကနေထိုင်လာခဲ့ကြတဲ့ဌာနေဒေသတစ်ခုဖြစ်ပါတယ်
The ancient Arakanis were descended from Aryan.
ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေကဆိုရင်အာရီယန်မျိုးနွယ်စုဝင်တွေဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Rohingya of today are true embodiment of the ancient people of Arakan. But in medieval time, there was reorientation eastward. The area fell under pagan dominance, and the Arakanese people began to speak a dialect of Burmese, which continues to this day.
ဒီမှာဆိုရင်အာရကန်ဒေသမှာဆိုရင်ဒီအာရကန်ဒေသရဲ့ဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်တွေက သူတို့တွေကဗမာဘာသာစကားကိုအခြေပြုတဲ့ရခိုင်ဘာသာစကားကိုပြောဆိုတာခဲ့ကြပါတယ်ယနေ့အချိန်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်
people to travel to the east by sea
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်
with Arakan even during the pre-Islamic days
အစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာထွန်းကားတဲ့ခေတ်မှာအာရကန်ဒေသကလည်းခေတ်ပြိုင်ထွန်းကားခဲ့တဲ့ဒေသတစ်ခုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
1788 AD some Hindu dynasties ruled over the certain limited area of this region along the capital along the river Lemu
မိမိတို့မှာ
in 788
အာရကန်ဒေသမှာဆိုရင်
a new
1900ဒေသမတိုင်ခင်ကတည်းကဟိန္ဒူလူမျိုးစုတွေရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်ဒီတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်ဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်တွေရောက်လာပါတယ်ပြီးတော့ဆိုရင်ဒီဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေဖြစ်တဲ့ဟိန္ဒူဘာသာဝင်တွေကလည်းဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာဝင်ကိုပူပြောင်းသွားပါတယ်ထိုနည်းတူစွာအချို့ကအစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာဝင်တွေဖြစ်လာခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
occurred over and over in the coast of Arakan and Chittagong
အဲ့ဒီအပြင်ဒီအာရကန်ဒေသနဲ့ချစ်တကောင်းဒေသနှစ်ခုကပူဆက်ရှယ်မှုတွေရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်
The Muslim population in Arakan went down during the long period of 5 centuries following the conquest of the Easterly Hindu kingdom of Wetali by the Mongolian
population. Hindu ဘုရင်နိုင်ငံကိုလည်းသိမ်းပိုက်နိုင်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
The Mrau was the last dynasty of Arakan. It was built
ဆိုတာကတော့အာရကန်ရဲ့နောက်ဆုံးဘုရင်နိုင်ငံတော်တစ်ခုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
He was reinstated to his throne by the king of Bengal with a
formidable force. Bengal ကဘုရင်ကဖျက်ဆီးဖို့ကြိုးစားခဲ့ပါတယ်
Mrau was the most glorious period. His kings adopted the Muslim title like Pasha.
ဥမာရှိတဲ့ဘုရင်တွေကအစ္စလာမ်ဘာသာဝင်တွေရဲ့ဘွဲ့အမိတွေကိုလည်းခံယူခဲ့ပါတယ်
and
ဒီအခါမှာဆိုရင်မိမိတို့ကမင်ကိုမင်းဆက်တွေနဲ့လည်းလူဆက်ဆံမှုပြုလုပ်ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
Kalama Islamic Declaration of Faith in Arabic script
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဆိုရင်အဲ့ဒီမှာအာရကန်ဒေသမှာဆိုရင်အာရဗီဘာသာစကားကိုလည်းရုံးသုံးဘာသာစကားအဖြစ်သုံးဆွဲခဲ့ပါတယ်နန်းတွင်းတွေထဲမှာလည်းသုံးခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
During his days as an independent kingdom until 1784 Arakan encompassed
1984မတိုင်ခုနှစ်အထိအာရကန်ဒေသက
in the southern part of today's Bangladesh
ဒေသယခုဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်နိုင်ငံတောင်ပိုင်းအထိဝင်ခဲ့ပါတယ်အာရကန်နဲ့ချစ်တကောင်းဒေသကဆိုရင်ခွဲခြားလို့မရခဲ့ပါဘူး
cultural and historical considerations quite often Muslim contribution in Arakan was too great to the extent that began with the spread of the Muslim civilization there because of the political and commercial link between those two territories. Korean used to call Arakan extended Chittagong and Chittagong Greater Arakan. For a long time there was no political boundary between Arakan and Chittagong. But the two territories embraced either Chittagong as an integral part of Arakan, Arakan as a federal state of Bengal for a considerable period of time, allowing either in Chittagong or Arakan or double home and citizenship in both provinces. This is true with the ethnic people living on all along the borders of Burma's vast territory. For example, and India, Chin people in Bangladesh, and in Thailand, and Marama in Bangladesh,
ခေါ်တဲ့လူတွေကလည်းဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်မှာနေကြပါတယ်မြန်မာမှာလည်းခွာပြီးနေကြပါတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးနေဆက်နေတဲ့ဆောက်ဟိုဘက်ဒီဘက်နိုင်ငံတွေမှာဆက်ပြီးတော့ဒီနိုင်ငံလူမျိုးစုတွေကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံလုံးမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
In the similar pattern the Rohingya also inhabiting
Rohingya တွေကလည်းချစ်တကောင်းမှာလည်းနေထိုင်ပါတယ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံရခိုင်ပြည်နယ်ယခုအခေါ်ရခိုင်ပြည်နယ် ယခင်အခေါ် Arakan ဒေသမှာလည်းနေထိုင်ခဲ့ကြပါတယ်
More people can be Rakhine in Burma and Bangladesh. Again, the same Mok and Rakhine can be
Mok ခေါ်တဲ့လူတွေကကြတော့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာရခိုင်လူမျိုးလို့ခေါ်ကြပါတယ်ဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်မှာတော့သူတို့ကို Mok လို့ခေါ်ပါတယ်
various ethnic background over the centuries there will be ethnic Rohingya after the name of Rohang
Rohingya တွေက Rohang လို့လည်းပြောကြပါတယ်
popular name in the region. The word Rohingya means people of Arakan or Rohang. Due to political persecutions and occasional wars or forced expulsion of people, the influx of refugees from Arakan into Bengal and Chittagong has almost been intermittent phenomena continues till today. In 1784, a number of people from Arakan, Rohingya, fled to Chittagong to escape massacre and persecution of the Burmese occupying forces. They assimilated in Bengal. For example, the Rohingya comprising nearly half of the population in southern Chittagong.
စစ်တကောင်းရဲ့တောင်ပိုင်းဒေသမှာဆိုရင်ထက်ဝက်ကျော်လောက်က
to Arakan.
ရခိုင်လူမျိုးတွေလည်းရှိပါတယ်ဗုဒ္ဓဘာသာကိုကိုးကွယ်ကြပါတယ်
Despite this, Burmese
ဒီလိုမျိုးဖြစ်လင့်ကစားမိမိတို့က
and the ultra nationalist Rakhine claim that the Rohingyas are
ဒီလိုမျိုးလူတွေကပေါ့နော်ကျွန်တော်တို့
any evidence
လူတွေကိုဘယ်လိုပြောကြလဲဆိုတော့ရခိုင်အစွန်းရောက်တွေကဘာပြောလဲဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုဘင်္ဂါလီလို့ပြောကြပါတယ်ခင်ဗျ
in the strict sense illegal immigration
သူတို့တွေရဲ့
migration that may have
အဆိုအရဆိုရင်တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကခိုးဝင်ဘင်္ဂါလီတွေလို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုသုံးနှုန်းကြပါတယ်ဒါကမမှန်ပါဘူးခင်ဗျာ
from any parts of India to Burma was perfect
ကျွန်တော်တို့က
and no
law
by the Burmese government, not even the infamous 1982
Mama အစိုးရတွေတောင်မရှိခင်မှာကျွန်တော်တို့လူမျိုးတွေကအဲ့ဒီဒေသမှာနေဝင်ရောက်နေထိုင်အခြေချနေခဲ့ကြသူတွေဒါလည်းဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Since 1942 program in Arakan
1942ခုနှစ်မှာပြဿနာအကြီးကြီးတက်ခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါကတော့ဘာလဲဆိုတော့
from 1962 military rule by General Navy, they have failed kinetic
လွတ်လပ်ရေးကာလကျိုးပန်းကနဦးကျိုးပန်းမှုတွေဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာမြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုပြီးတော့နိုင်ငံတစ်ခုပေါ်လာပြီးတော့လွတ်လပ်ရေးရသွားပါတယ်
into Bangladesh and other countries
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်ရှိပါတယ်
communities of non-Rohingya from impoverished Arakan are in
ပြီးတဲ့အခါမှာ1962မှာအာဏာသိမ်းမှုဖြစ်ခဲ့ပါတယ်
it would make very little sense
ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအခုဒီမှာက
in a more improvised
ဘင်္ဂလားဒေ့ရှ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ခေါ်တဲ့နိုင်ငံကပေါ်လာတာကမကြသေးခင်ကမှပေါ်လာတာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ထိုနည်း၎င်းပါပဲမြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုတဲ့နိုင်ငံကလည်းပေါ်လာတာကလည်းလွတ်လပ်ရေးရပြီးမှမြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုပြီးတော့ပေါ်လာတာခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခေတ်သစ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံဆိုပြီးပေါ်လာခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျအဲ့ဒီလိုမျိုးနိုင်ငံအသစ်တွေမရှိခင်ကတည်းကကျွန်တော်တို့လူမျိုးစုရိုဟင်ဂျာလူမျိုးစုကဒီဒေသတွေမှာကြိုပြီးတော့ရောက်နှင့်ကြာပြီးဖြစ်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျ
and the Burmese legislation section 31 of the union
မြန်မာဥပဒေမှာဆိုရင်
amended as December 1960 states for the purpose of the constitution
1962မှာ
the expression any of the indigenous races of
Burma ပြောထားလဲဆိုတော့မြန်မာနိုင်ငံရဲ့ကရင်ဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားတွေထိုသူတွေကိုကချင်ချင်းကရင်ရှမ်းမွန်
as has
ရခိုင်ဆိုပြီးတော့ပြောထားပါတယ်ဒီလူတွေက
within the union as their permanent home from
မိမိတို့ရဲ့ဒေသမှာဌာနေနိုင်ငံပြင်ရင်းနိုင်ငံအဖြစ်အစဉ်တစိုက်နေထိုင်ခဲ့ကြသူများဒီ
political consideration
လိုလျောက်နိုင်ငံသားများဖြစ်ရမည်ဆိုပြီးတော့ရေးသားထားပါတယ်
to a hybridized or mixed
ပြောချင်တာကကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့တမိုင်းကပုံဖြတ်ခြင်းခံထားရပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့တမိုင်းကဖြောက်ထားခြင်းခံရပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကဌာနေတိုင်းရင်းသားဖြစ်လင့်ကစားကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုကဲကျင်ထားကြပါတယ်
Council up to 2015.
အဲ့ဒီတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့2015ခုနှစ်မှာလဲကျွန်တော်တို့တွေကဒီကောက်ပွဲမှာလွတ်လပ်စွာဝေပြိုင်ခွင့်မရခဲ့ပါဘူး
November 1947.
ပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့နိုဝင်ဘာ1948ခုနှစ်ကိုပြန်ကြည့်မယ်ဆိုရင်လည်း
Rohingya in the state of Arakan is Muslim.
Rohingya ဒေသမှာရှိတဲ့ Arakan Muslim တွေကို Rohingya လို့ခေါ်ပါသည်လို့ရေးသားထားချက်တွေရှိပါတယ်
Burma Broadcasting Service
ပြီးတော့
Rohingya News Program
Burma Broadcasting Service BBS လို့ခေါ်ခဲ့တဲ့တစ်ချိန်လုံးကအတန်လွင့်ဌာနရှိခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာ Rohingya ဘာသာစကားကိုလွှင့်ထုတ်လွှင့်ခဲ့ပါတယ်တိုင်းရင်းသားဘာသာအစီအစဉ်အနေနဲ့အတိအမှတ်ပြုခဲ့ပါတယ်ဒါကလွတ်လပ်ရေးရပြီးတဲ့အချိန်ကာလတွေမှာကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုတိုင်းရင်းသားအဖြစ်အတိအမှတ်ပြုခဲ့တဲ့အချိန်ကာလတွေလည်းရှိခဲ့ပါသေးတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi with the hope that
Nobel ဆုရှင်ဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်ခေတ်ရောက်ပြန်တော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအင်မတန်မှကိုမျှော်လင့်ချက်ကြီးကြီးထားခဲ့ကြပါတယ်တရားသဖြင့်တိုင်းပြည်ကိုအုပ်ချုပ်မယ်လူတိုင်းအခွင့်အရေးတွေရမယ်လို့မျှော်လင့်ခဲ့ကြတော့ညလဲဘာတွေဖြစ်ခဲ့လဲဆိုတော့စစ်တပ်ရဲ့ဒီကျွန်တော်တို့ဆက်မှုတွေကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အဲ့ဒီမှာဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်တို့ကရင်ကုန်နှုတ်ပိတ်နှုတ်ဆက်နေခဲ့ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
The ethnic Rohingyas have lost all
Rohingya တိုင်းရင်းသားတွေကအခွင့်အရေးတွေဆုံးရှုံးခဲ့ပါတယ်မိမိတို့နေအိမ်တွေကနေမောင်းထုတ်ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အခြားဒေသကိုတွန်းပို့ခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်အစုလိုက်အပြုံလိုက်မောင်းထုတ်ခြင်းခံခဲ့ရပါတယ်ဒါအပြင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုကိုယ်အိမ်မှာနေတဲ့သူတွေကိုတခြားနေရာကနေခိုးဝင်လာသူတွေလို့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကိုဆွဆွဲကြပါတယ်အဲ့ဒါက Nobel ဆုရှင်ဒေါ်အောင်ဆန်းစုကြည်ခေတ်မှာဖြစ်ခဲ့တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်နောက်ပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေအစုလိုက်အပြုံလိုက်လူမျိုးတုံးတပ်ပွဲကိုကျွန်တော်တို့ရင်ဆိုင်ခဲ့ရပါတယ်
However, it should be emphasized that the return to military rule is unacceptable.
အခုကျွန်တော်တို့က
Burma embraces
မြန်မာနိုင်ငံမှာစစ်တပ်ရဲ့အာဏာသိမ်းမှုကိုပြန်လည်ခံလိုက်ရပါပြီ
regardless of race, ethnicity and
အဲ့ဒီကြောင့်ဘာဖြစ်လာလဲဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကအခုကအားလုံးရောပြုံးပြီးတော့ဖိနှိပ်ညှဉ်းပန်းနှိပ်စက်မှုတွေကိုအတူတူခံစားနေရပါပြီဘယ်ဘာသာပဲကိုယ်ကွယ်ကွယ်ဘယ်လူမျိုးပဲဖြစ်ဖြစ်ကျွန်တော်တို့အားလုံးကအတူတူညှဉ်းပန်းနှိပ်စက်မှုကိုခံနေရပါပြီအဲ့ဒီအတွက်ကြောင့်မိမိတို့ကအခုကအားလုံးကအတူတကွယုံထားရမယ်အချိန်ဖြစ်ပါပြီမိမိတို့ကကိုယ်ပိုင်ပြဋ္ဌာန်းခွင့်တွေကိုတောင်းဆိုရမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဆိုတော့အဲ့ဒီအချိန်မျိုးမှာဆိုရင်ကျွန်တော်တို့ရဲ့အခွင့်အရေးကိုလည်းကျွန်တော်တို့ကတောင်းဆိုပါတယ်ခင်ဗျတရားသဖြင့်နီးလန်းကနေကျွန်တော်တို့ကတောင်းဆိုပါတယ်
under the future federal union
အဲ့ဒီတော့ကျွန်တော်တို့ကမြန်မာနိုင်ငံကြီးကိုအနာဂတ်မြန်မာနိုင်ငံက Federal ခေတ်သစ်ပြည်ထောင်စုနိုင်ငံတော်အဖြစ်ရရှိရေးအတွက်ကျွန်တော်တို့ကစုမှုကောင်းတောင်းပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်တို့လည်းတကယ်မျှော်လင့်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျဒါမှဒါနဲ့တိုင်းပြည်ကြီးကလူမျိုးပေါင်းစုံဘာသာပေါင်းစုံတရားဝါပြောစွာနေထိုင်နိုင်တဲ့တိုင်းပြည်ကြီးဖြစ်နေမှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်
This is a fair coherent
ဒီလိုလုံမှသာလင်ကျွန်တော်တို့တွေက
Thank you for your listening Thank you
တိုင်းပြည်တိုးတက်မှာဖြစ်ပါတယ်အခုလိုမျိုးနားထောင်ပေးတာကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်ခင်ဗျာ
Chairman Nurul Islam and to everyone who's experiencing sound issues we'll continue to work on it just make sure that you have the channel that you want selected and click original audio off and we will continue to improve it. In the meantime, I'm going to pass the floor on now to Professor Michael Charney. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting me today to give my thoughts on Rohingya history. I'm going to give some general impressions because the time isn't huge and because I know that this is being translated for multiple audiences and I want to be kind to the translators. Like all ethnic groups in Myanmar, the origins of the Rohingya identification or self-identity has murky origins. We do not have the details, never will, on exactly how the process of ethnic formation occurred in its earliest centuries. We know that we know that Islam there's a good chance Islam has been present in Rakhine, at least since the 7th century. It would also appear that the main population base of Rakhine was for thousands of years shared with Bengal, and that Burman immigrants from the Irrawaddy Valley began to move across the Rakhine Yoma in the early modern period, perhaps as early as 11th century, and in larger numbers as part of the wars between Inwa and Bago in the early 15th century. Afterwards, more immigrants were attracted to a Muslim Buddhist court in Rau from the 1430s. We know almost nothing about Burmese-speaking Theravada Buddhists in Rakhine before this time. Burmese language literature has a poem, the Rakhine myth Mie Jin from the early 15th century, which actually is connected to an Upper Burma princess planted in Rakhine. Inscriptions before this time are mainly in Devanagari, not in Burmese script. There is no real history, just history, created later on perhaps from myths and legends, but certainly not any recorded facts. In other words, we have very little evidence on either Muslim or Theravada Buddhist Burmese speakers in Rakhine before the early 15th century. From that time, the Mrau court was part of the Bay of Bengal world, circulated literati, military elites, and religious teachers throughout the region, and adopted a syncretic court culture that provided welcome home to both Muslims and to Buddhists. The dual religious identity of the court cemented its control over heavily Muslim Chittagong in the north and heavily Theravada Buddhist Thandwe in the south from the late 15th century. Probably everyone in Rakhine saw themselves as politically Rakhine, in political affiliation to the Mrau court. My view is that the Rohingya owe the emergence of their ethnicity not as much from these sources as from the tens of thousands of captives who were raided from Bengal and resettled and intermarried with local Rakhine in the Galadan River area from the 16th and particularly from the 17th century. The raids on Bengal for these captives is well documented. Some were sold to the Dutch, others sent to the Rakhine court to serve as Mudan, royal service people. Many others, perhaps most, were sent to form villages in the Galadan River area, where they opened up rice fields and produced the rice that the court then sold to the Dutch in the 17th century. Again, well documented. What we do not have are the detailed records of each individual who was taken, not because these records did not exist, but because they were burned by the Dutch as part of a clearance of old records in the 19th century. Again, well documented. By the mid-18th century, the population of Rakhine was estimated to be of 75% Bengal origin, that is, descended from these captives. Although many over the years would have died from malaria and other endemic diseases of the region, and others would flee from the Burman conquest and harsh rule from 1785, when British rule was extended over Rakhine in the 1820s, there were still an estimated 25,000 descendants of these captives left in Rakhine, 1/4 of the overall population. Many more were likely living across the Naf River in the Chittagong area from the later 1780s. When Francis Buchanan interviewed Rohingya here, they referred to themselves by that name, Rohingya, and argued that they and not the Burman residents in Rakhine at the time were the natives of Rakhine. My own idea, my own theory is that when they referred to themselves as Rakhine, or from Rakhine, they used the Bengali word for Rakhine that they carried with them to the region from the 15th century. And this, plus being a person from this area, came to be the Rohingya that we have today. At that time, both Rohingya and Rakhine meant being a native of Rakhine, depending on which dialect of language one used, and one had the peculiar culture, the peculiar material culture of their community that they saw as being the genuine Rakhine culture. The big irony is that many of the detractors will say that the British did not record them as Rohingya, but as Arakan Muslims, which is the historical foundation of what Rohingya probably means for most. In actuality, they are Rakhine who would define their ethnicity around their Muslim culture and called this Rohingya. There were also a smaller number of Hindus who also called themselves Rohingya and defined their ethnicity around their Hindu culture. This is the way that ethnicity is formed. Under the Burman administration from 1785 and the British administration from the mid-1820s, The Burmese language version of the ethnic referent was the one which was recorded. The Burmese version of this was the one that was recorded in the records. Probably many who call themselves at home Rohingya, and some were probably Buddhists as well as Muslim, were recorded as being Arakan in the records. In fact, later in the 19th century, the British authorities would tell their census takers in Arakan to avoid recording local versions of names for population groups, and just sort out everybody according to the prefix template that they had already put together on the basis of the rest of Burma and India. Rohingya as a referent gets erased from the Burma records and the way data was compiled, so that anyone who looks Indian was suddenly labeled as a foreign migrant. The Rohingya get labeled Chittagonian or Bengali or Arakanese Muslims at different times, but as cultivators in rural areas outside of the mainstream of colonial Burma, this meant that they lacked agency in colonial data collection and the colonial construction of knowledge. This task was left instead in the hands of British officials and Burmese subordinates who wanted administrative simplicity. More importantly, Western Orientalism had constructed knowledge about Burma to pigeonhole it and legitimate rule. Buddhist Burmese were under British rule because Buddhism, the religion, kept them focused on religion and not on industry, and thus unproductive economically. The British praised Muslims in Rakhine as hardworking, clever agriculturalists. It benefited the British to argue that the native Burmese, including the Rakhine, who were Buddhists, to claim that they were Buddhists because they then needed colonial guidance and management to make them economically productive. If the Rohingya, those Muslims speaking a dialect of Bengali, were the actual natives in parts of Rakhine, then British rule was actually unnecessary. Instead, if the Rohingya were depicted as foreign immigrants who came because of British rule and made the land productive, then this helped to legitimate the colonial project. Simplicity and legitimation of colonial rule through our colonization of knowledge about Burma meant that the Rohingya had to be foreign in colonial era. As part of British India, which until 1937 included Burma, the Rohingya looked at both emerging political discourses on Pakistan and Burma. There were certainly advocates of each. The communal problems, though, seem to have really been brought out in Rakhine by the chaos of the Japanese invasion in 1942 and the separation of different parts of the region between the British and the Japanese lines for much of the war. The administrative and colonial approach to knowledge about Rohingya, as I mentioned earlier, continued into the post-colonial period and into the Cold War because it served the construction of area studies knowledge about the world by the U.S. It was easier to cut up the world into numerous monolingual national states that could be won over from the communists like gambling chips than to deal with the full complexities of each political unit as constructed under colonial rule. So for all those Americans and British, were studying Myanmar, it was a Buddhist, Burmese-speaking country. All of it, historically, going well into the origins of the historical past, as well as the present. The Burmans, who exerted hegemony over Myanmar in 1948, agreed, but it was really the military takeover in 1962 that saw the government stepping towards full-fledged paradigms that excluded the Rohingya and others. History was rewritten along nationalist lines that promoted the military's role in history and portrayed it as a savior of the nation. Republishings of the Chronicles saw the military require that these rewrite the names of ethnic groups according to new official versions. The National Museum put up depictions of all of Myanmar's peoples that the military recognized and left others out. The military then went on to claim that the oldest human beings anywhere in the world were discovered in Myanmar. My view is that the people who have become the Rohingya are historically Rakhine, as much or more than other groups living in Rakhine. Once we drop Orientalist, colonial, Cold War, and nationalist constructions of knowledge, we find that the Rohingya have emerged as an ethnic group in the same way as most other ethnic groups in the country. Many were refugees or transplanted war captives. Groups like the Karen spoke scores of dialects until missionaries clarified these down to two. Who are the Mon? Are they the same as the Raman? or as the groups who called themselves in the 19th century Abbasis? Or do we go to the Burmese word line, and do we accept their connection with European references to Paguin? Which group today is the Gui, who were settled in areas around Inwa, actually, and in areas that the Kachin are today, in the 18th century and early? Are the Thet, the Chakma? European accounts in the 19th century claim that the Rakhine Buddhists did not call themselves Rakhine, but rather refer to themselves as Marama. Indeed, we even have Marma, Chantha, Tantha, all of whom claim or could be claimed to be Rakhine Buddhists. The main point I would assert is that when you go picking through ethnicities in Myanmar to learn their history, a lot of the groundwork for everyone was done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Those who promote a Burman Buddhist identity as the natural state of the population of the country do not really understand that their identity too has undergone the same degree of invention, from heterogeneity to homogeneity, because they have been politically dominant for so long, before colonial rule and after colonial rule, and even held the position of the true native stock in the period in between. It is Burman records that have been preserved, Burmese language and Burmese versions of reference that are official, of ethnic reference that are official. Their histories, mythologies that are preserved and seen as legitimate. They are standard. They suffer from the same blindness that comes out from what Matthew Walton has called Burman privilege. It is the same curse that has shaped the white privilege and colonial knowledge of the West. It is the same kind of pillar that, like that of Eurocentrism, needs to be toppled to move beyond the misimagined constructed world and see the world as it really is, or really should have been before the European conquest of the globe. So to come back to my initial proposition, how do we decolonize Rakhine history? As is the case with other ethnic races or minorities in Myanmar, this means rectifying the misconstructions of Oriental scholarship and neo-colonial scholarship. But it also means recognizing that in Myanmar, Burman constructions of knowledge work hand in hand with colonial authorities to produce a Myanmar that fit the Burman imaginary. The task at hand is also decolonizing the Burman imprint on knowledge about Myanmar and its peoples, its history, its culture, and its religion. It means holding Burmans to task and persuading them to recognize the Burman privilege they operate under on a daily basis at every level in the country. It also means restoring the wrongs done by Burman nationalism, particularly under the military dictatorship from 1962. How do we recover Rohingya history? We can look at the efforts of African Americans to recover their histories. Like those who have emerged as Rohingya, they too were forced to come to America as slaves, to work as cultivators for the profit of others. They were not treated as equal and were blocked by white nationalists from full political equality. They were attacked from organized anti-black white organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and suffered lynchings. If we substitute Rohingya for African American and Burman for white, we see what a struggle the Rohingya faced in Myanmar even before 2017. In the U.S., African Americans were also denied to have a history other than that as a footnote in an overwhelmingly white national narrative. Currently, and unfortunately, there are some who are working heavily to try to disprove the Rohingya have a history in the country. This distasteful practice would be very much like trying to claim that African Americans were not American because they were brought to the country as slaves. That because the latter were not originally recognized by the U.S. Constitution as citizens, they do not deserve to be citizens today. If we are going to recover Rohingya history, we will have to use the decolonization toolkit and apply it to Myanmar's history with a view towards a more inclusive history that recognizes the authoritative historical texts and records of Myanmar's past are merely the narrow reflections of a particular and privileged proto-ethnic and religious view on the country's past, and not a genuinely objective record. We will need to make the profession of history in Myanmar and about Myanmar more ethnically and gender inclusive, something we should have done. We should have actually done that today. We should have had a female Rohingya scholar as well, but maybe in the future. But I hope we will rectify this in the future. We will need to train Rohingya in historical research method, fund historically reconstructive work on the Rohingya's past, and recognize that much of Rakhine history is shared by the Rohingya, and not again the exclusive possession of one privileged ethnic and religious group in the region. We will need to recognize that all ethnicities in the country are equal parts historical and equal parts imaginary. All of them. We can only achieve this if we communicate with the Burman Buddhist historians on the need to eradicate bigotry in the Myanmar Academy. We will also need to question the very real existence of racism and Islamophobia in the Western Academy. That focuses on Myanmar and Theravada Buddhist studies. Now, my presentation has been shorter than 20 minutes, but I think that may, I'd like to pass on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charney. That was really enlightening, and thank you to Mr. Nurul Islam. That was really good too. So now, Dr. Siddiqui, the floor is yours, and I know that you have a presentation to share. So I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Regina. Can you see my screen?
Regina,
yes, you can.
Regina,
okay. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to talk on a subject of tremendous importance in our time. The topic that has been given to me to speak up is challenging Rakhine and military narratives about the Rohingyas of Myanmar. After hearing from both Nurul Islam and Professor Charney, I find myself in a very odd kind of position, in the sense that after hearing from them, there is nothing more probably to share. But nonetheless, given the fact that I have been chosen as a speaker, I'm going to share some slides and trying to talk about oppression, marginalization, violence, and propaganda. None of it is new. What is new, however, in our time is the mere scale, the frequency, and omnipresence of disinformation, especially when it is propagated by a very powerful group that runs at the state level. To eliminate a targeted minority that is different by color, language, ethnicity, religion, customs, and culture, and everything. And nowhere in our time is this issue perhaps more acute than in Myanmar, where the project there has become a national project which is enjoying support from the top rank to the lowest rank and the corner within the Buddhist society. From a military man in uniform to a monk in saffron robe, from a peasant in the paddy field to a politician working or wearing a lungi. The decades of disinformation campaigns against Rohingya people have robbed the persecuted, the Buddhist people, of its moral teachings about what defines our humanity and the values of compassion and empathy for a fellow human being. Even the R word, the shortcut for Rohingya, is a forbidden taboo in Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi won't talk about it, won't utter it, nor would she allow or did allow any of our people to say the R word. To them, Rohingya is an invention that is concocted by Chittagonian Bengalis like myself to grab the Buddhist land. In so doing, these chauvinists forget the history of the geographical region that we commonly know today as South Asia and Southeast Asia has no one beginning, no one chronology, no single plot or narrative. And this fact has been recognized by great historians of the past and present. That includes Professor David Laden, Abdul Karim, Richard Eaton, Romila Thapar, R.S. Sharma, Juan Cole, and we have in our audience panel Dr. Chani, among many others, who spend their lifetime to study the region. To these unbiased historians of the ancient world, the region did not have a single history, but many histories with indefinite contested origins and with countless separate trajectories that multiply the more we learn about the region. Myanmar, bordering Bangladesh today, India, in the West, is no exception to that general group. Today's Myanmar has about 57 million people. According to 2014 government census, about 54 million people, 51 million people. And of this, the majority comprise the Buddhist people, almost 88%, according to the CIA fact book. And the Burman race who run the country, they comprise almost 2/3 of the population. There are 135 ethnic races that are recognized, of which obviously Rohingya don't belong. They're part of probably 140 or more races that live in that country. Denied citizenship since 1982 because they are considered as aliens or influx viruses, something that should be wiped out. So they have been totally discounted. The history of Burma had changed. It is now called Myanmar. Various territories, the states, have been also renamed. The Arakan is a Rakhine state because obviously Rakhine people are the majority. The Rohingyas have been victims of genocide since at least 1942, and you have already heard Nurul Islam Bhai to talk about that. I want to just share some of the speeches and writings from the people within Burma as to how they prepared the people for the ultimate execution of the genocidal program. Burmese Consulate General Min Aung very famously said a few years ago, more than a decade ago, that the Rohingyas are as ugly as ogres. Interestingly, such highly offensive, derogatory remarks didn't hurt his career. He was appointed as the ambassador to Switzerland. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who runs the country since February of this year, he famously said that Rohingyas are the Bengalis who do not have the characteristics of culture in common with the ethnicities of Myanmar. Wirathu, who has been called the Buddhist Bin Laden, has been using the term Khalad, a very offensive kind of term, very much similar to the leaders that are used against the Afro-Americans brought to America. When he was asked, is it possible that the Buddhist people, and especially the soldiers, had raped the Rohingya women? He said it is impossible because the Rohingyas are not beautiful enough. Their bodies are too disgusting. And he, by the way, is not alone in making those kind of highly offensive remarks about people that have been marginalized, that are victims of genocide. One of the MPs, elected MPs in Rakhine, he said in an interview with BBC journalist Ong Win that Rohingyas are too dirty, their women are too dirty, and so there is no way any Buddhist man or soldier would be tempted to rape Rohingya women. To many Buddhists living in Arakan and also in Burma, the Rohingyas have been described as the terrorists or extremists. One of their academics who have made a living out of selling bigotry, Dr. Aichan, who himself finds himself as an academic in Japan, a foreign country, calls the Rohingyas influx virus that should be wiped out. Another Buddhist extremist, King Mong So, said that Rohingya infiltration in Burma and especially in Arakan is more like a camel in a famous Burmese story about a camel that tried to dislodge its owner. So unless the Burmese and the Rakhine people wake up, the Chittagoni and Bengalis are going to take over their place, just like that camel in that Burmese fable. Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, who is the de facto leader, in September 2017, he said that we have to finish what was left unfinished back in 1942 during the Second World War. And we'll get into what did happen in Second World War, and you have already heard something from our two scholars. Since 2012, and this, by the way, is not the beginning. In my count, it is probably the 20th and the later kind of incidents of the genocidal programs that the Rohingyas have been facing. Hundreds of houses and villages have been burned, people have been killed, and there is no pain to their suffering. Here is a picture taken by Reuters, and you could see what has happened in a Rohingya neighborhood in Mongdong, which is close to the border in Bangladesh. Their homes and everything were burned down. This is a picture from 2012 before.